Hi, everybody. Sorry I could not be at school today. However, we do need to start the Renaissance notes. So you should have the notes questions. As we did in the last set of notes, you're going to answer questions as we go through each slide. At any point, if you need to pause the video, please do so. And if you need to rewind, you can do that as well. If there's at any point you also have a question about the notes, please send me a message via Canvas. And if you would, please reference the slide number and tell me what your question is, if I need to elaborate or you didn't understand something, or if you felt like something was incomplete. All right, let's get started. All right, so the Renaissance starts in Italy. Okay, so it's where the birth of the Renaissance is. And when we say the birth, it's because at this point in time in history, they're coming out of the Black Plague. And the Black Plague devastated Europe to such an extreme, we use the term rebirth. Is it correct? Not necessarily, but it is the terminology that's referred there. It's very, very what we call ethnocentric, meaning it's centered strictly onto Europe. Other parts of the world did not necessarily experience the plague as severely as Europe did, and their worlds kind of went on. So this is strictly in reference to Europe. So this is that term. That term is being used to do the transition from medieval times, and then the plague kind of capped the medieval times, and then it's the beginning of what we call the modern world. So we're going to see massive changes happen during this period, which is why there was so much weight given to the word that they chose to name it. So during the Renaissance, people had different viewpoints of what they'd seen during the medieval ages. Medieval ages, everything was centered around the church, and whatever the church said, it went, and people didn't really question it. Science wasn't really a great influencer yet, but during the Renaissance, we're going to see that kind of flip. Also, prior to the Renaissance, that emphasis of it's what's for the greater good. During the Renaissance, we see more is what's good for me. So it's individual achievement. So the Renaissance, we also see, and I know I'm saying Renaissance a lot, but I want to reinforce that. We see that people want to get away from the chaos and the plague. So we see a lot more organization to bring more order to the community. Which leads into the development of the sciences during this time, which we'll get into a little bit later. So they create a new worldview by building on classical Greek and Roman learning. So they didn't want to get rid of everything that had been done before this time. They wanted to build upon what had already been established, but some of that went by the wayside as religion became much more prevalent and stronger to solve the situations. We have to remember at that time also that people were largely illiterate, so they were reliant on their priests to tell them what things were. Okay? So humanism becomes a core foundation of the Renaissance. People who practice humanism are referred to as humanist. So again, they focus on issues of the world versus religion. They believe that education should stimulate the creativity. So by exposing you to multiple things, that would stimulate your creativity. And they believe there were certain things that were extremely important. So things like what we would refer to as English language arts today, grammar, rhetoric, and poetry, and then, of course, history. So they, like other scholars, will go back to the ancient Greek and Roman studies and to learn more about how their culture evolved and, how it will continue to go forward. So they use that as that foundation, that classical learning. Francesco Petrarch was an early humanist, He was a well-known poet and scholar. He was from Florence, Italy. Florence is going to become a home to, it becomes a very fast developing area of the Renaissance. So he managed to acquire different books to stock churches and monasteries. He also wrote his poems. Of the most famous is called Sonnets to Laura, and what this would do was influence other writers. But what's most important about Petrarch is that he wrote in the vernacular. In addition to Latin, Latin was the primary language. Now, to understand Latin, you were most likely of the middle and upper classes because you had to have money to be able to afford to send somebody to school to be able to read it. So that's one reason he writes in the vernacular. Vernacular means the local language. So by writing in the vernacular, that allowed people who were not necessarily educated at a higher level to possibly learn how to read his works. That's pretty pivotal for this time because that concept really wasn't there yet. We'll see more influence in this when we get into the Reformation. So we see things change. We see more emphasis on trade instead of farming. We see the importance of exploring. So we're going to see navigators start sailing across various oceans. Some will be successful, some will not. Science becomes extremely important during this time, and scientists, they kind of walk this tightrope of what they deemed was scientific fact versus what the community and the church viewed. At times, scientists would be forced to change their ideas. Not as often during the Renaissance as prior to that, but they still had that influence of the church. And you got to remember at this time, the church, that is, when we refer to the church, it's the Italian Catholic Church. Okay, at this point, we don't have any other types of religions in Christianity. You are Catholic, or, you could be practicing at this point. You could be a Muslim, you could be a Jewish, or an indigenous language in some areas of the world, or religion in some areas of the world. But if you were Christian, you were Catholic. Okay. So we also see, of course, branching out from the writers and the artists. And they would experiment with various types of techniques. So as we proceed through these next few slides, know that we're not going to get through all of the slides today, so we're just going to do a portion of it because you have other activities to do. So we will end with slide 11. Now, why did Italy become the center of the Renaissance, and why did it develop here? A lot of it had to do with its location. Italy was an important area of trade for what we call the Middle East, for Northern Africa, for all of Europe. And being centered in the Mediterranean makes it more conducive to that. So in this region, you had a fairly strong economic foundation. So you had banking, you had manufacturing, and then you had the trade of merchants that would get by either by land or ship. And Italy's location by land was also quite beneficial, just because, again, it kind of centralized to the middle of Europe as well. But more importantly was those other overseas areas that they could get within the Mediterranean fairly quickly with the Middle East and North Africa as well. Now, the new ideas that are going on in Europe are not isolated to Europe. So with this trade, various merchants from other regions, such as Asia, and various Muslim scholars that had come to Europe to learn, are taking back what they learn and what they see to their own areas. And that's going to fuel a larger desire to expand on these areas as well. And it will actually end up strengthening trade. So in the next one, we're going to take a look at a map, and I want to just point out different things on the map, and I want to show you the impact of Italy's location. Okay, so when we look here, all of this is what we call modern day Italy. So the one thing that we should be aware of, which I'm not sure that I mentioned before, is that Italy is not actually a country yet. Italy is actually one of the newer countries in Europe. So it's not that old. So really when we're looking at this, we're looking at states in Italy. Okay, so you have Naples, Naples, the Papal States, you've got Florence and Venice, which they're pretty much named after the major city. You have Savoy, down here we have Sardinia and Sicily and Corsica. Okay, so these are all parts of Italy, but it's not actually one particular state. All of these are separate individual areas. Okay, so as you can see that Spain here has control of parts of what we now call Italy, Sardinia, Sicily, and Naples. Okay, so that pretty much tells us that Spain has a good economic and probably physical hold of this area. So they're a pretty powerful country at this point. Now, if we look at the green lines, these are all the trade routes. So you can see going into North Africa down here, going over to Crete. This is modern day Greece right here, but into the Ottoman Empire, which we now refer to. Parts of it's still part of Europe, part of it's in the Middle East. So, okay, let's move on to the next slide. We have 3 more to do. So when we look at medieval Europe, it's primarily agriculture versus urban society, which means urban means city, in the Renaissance. You don't really trade between countries in medieval as much, but during Renaissance it increases. Medieval Europe focuses strictly on religious studies, whereas Renaissance Europe focuses on the humanities. Renaissance value that individual achievement, whereas the medieval Europe doesn't really put that individual value. Although the medieval Europe preserves that classical works and studies, they don't really utilize them. Unlike Renaissance Europe, they make those the foundation of further studies and to expand their humanist studies. So Italy, as we see back in the map and where we saw those republics, those are city-states. And they're extremely vital in the Renaissance because each one is ran by a different family. And that family is usually very wealthy and very powerful as a merchant. So not only did they gain wealth and leadership, they did use their money to benefit the city as a whole. So they were interested in that art. They also studied in different areas, but more importantly, they put money forth to pay for art by artists, and they supported those artists, writers, and scholars. That's where you get kind of like today, that's where the term patron comes from. It's a supporter of something of the arts. So it could be acting, it could be music, it could be writing, it could be actual physical artwork. So that's where that term comes from. Okay, we're going to move to our last slide and call it a day at this point after that slide. So the Medici family is a particular family that controlled Florence. They gained control after 1434. They were originally headed by Lorenzo de' Medici. And Lorenzo was very vital in inviting people of various backgrounds to the city of Florence, and he provided for them so that they could develop their skill set. And what this does is it develops the culture of Florence, and it makes it very desirable by others. So merchants and so forth will come there. What it provides an opportunity to just the regular people because they were able to access art that was not based in the church. So it gave them a more rounded being. Okay, once you complete your questions, upload them to Canvas and send me a message if you have any questions. Have a great day. Move on to the next